Hello everyone, boys, girls, ladies and gentlemen, and everyone in between, because we're in 2024. Welcome to the Left Hook podcast. My name is James, and I am joined back from the land of the rising sun, my co-host, Jordie.
G'day, mate. It's good to be back.
It's good to have you back, mate. I do have to say, a massive shout out to friend of the show, Habiba, who filled in Jordie's big shoes and was my co-captain for a couple weeks. But I'm very glad to have you back, mate. While you have been away, in the words of Vladimir Lenin, there are weeks where decades happen and there are decades where weeks happen.
Yes, you've summed it up. It's been fast-paced.
It has
the
been
global shifting tides.
It has,
It's
mate.
been incredible to see. And yeah, as you said, thanks for filling in Habiba.
Mm-hmm.
It was wonderful. I listened to the podcast while I was away.
Very good.
And she did a fantastic job.
Yeah, I was very lucky to be joined.
Definitely have to have her back in the future. So thank you for that.
No worries, mate. So, Jordie, mate.
Yeah.
Please break down your trip, mate. How did it all go? What did you learn?
Well, look, I'm not going to give you a travel vlog.
Okay. There's too many of those already.
But I did fall down a little kind of, a little hole, a little
Yes.
information hole. So I started reading a lot about Japanese history and kind of about the contemporary political issues.
Mm-hmm.
And really fascinating because I think here in Australia, it's something that's overlooked because it's sort of part of Asia.
Yeah.
And we seem to be very Western focused here in Australia. We tend to kind of overlook what's going on in other countries around the world.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought Japan was an incredible place, and their history is very fascinating. What's been going on in their economy and their political system, I also found very intriguing. So, I guess what I think is worth noting is that obviously after World War II and the United States defeated the Japanese, they sort of, in effect, kind of colonized them in the sense that they went in there and it was American lawyers that wrote up the new constitution after World War II. So they ensured that Japan pretty much became a pro-capitalist kind of Western outpost.
Yeah. So a truly sovereign nation.
A truly sovereign nation. The Yanks really built the country up.
Yes.
They really made sure that there was going to be a free market economy. It was going to have a kind of quasi-Western sort of liberal constitution. And basically they wrote up a constitutional monarchy for Japan.
Yep.
And obviously
So they still have the emperor?
Yeah, as a figurehead. And so they went into the Cold War. Obviously, Japan was an outpost, pro-Western outpost. And during the Korean War and Vietnam War, they actually used the Japanese manufacturing sector to boost and supply the American army.
Yeah.
Right through the Cold War. So I thought that was pretty interesting and pretty fascinating. And what I couldn't actually believe was their economic growth.
Yes.
So from the 1950s to the 1970s, 10% economic growth for 2 decades in Japan.
Wow.
Really incredible.
Yep.
And then that was still, I think, right through the 1970s, about 5%. And that was really the golden era.
Yeah. So that's what we think of. That's where they're kind of the Japanese technology industry and like automotive industry kind of took off as well.
That's right. And that became so big in the 1980s that the United States started to get a little bit prickly behind the neck, a little bit uncomfortable.
Yes.
By the 1970s, they were the second largest global economy behind the United States. And as all good imperial hegemons do, they couldn't allow that to continue.
No,
so, are you familiar with the Plaza Accords?
I'm very familiar with
You're
the
familiar
Plaza
with them?
Accords, Jordie. Why don't you fill in our audience?
So for our listeners, the Plaza Accords was basically a agreement. It was a meeting between the United States and its allies, so the European Union, to devalue the US dollar in relation to the yen. And so at that time, Japan was a major export economy. Heaps of electronics, obviously like Toshiba radios, Japanese cars, Yamaha, all those kinds of things. And to destroy the value of their exports and their how competitive they were in the global market, the US devalued the dollar, which was obviously used globally, against the yen. So it made Japanese exports a lot less attractive.
Yeah, a lot more expensive, obviously.
That's right, correct. Obviously, there's that famous story of some Republican senators out the front of Congress burning, like smashing Toshiba radios down the steps.
That's funny. You know, it's funny you mention that because now, obviously, in our kind of Western consumerist society, this stereotype doesn't exist as much at the moment, but over the early 2000s, 2010s, there was the concept that like Chinese goods were all cheap and crappy.
Yeah.
So when I've spoken to older people about this similar thing, they said the same thing in the 80s. They used to dub products Japanese junk
Yeah.
So if you buy like a Toshiba cassette player, it was Japanese junk. We don't want that.
Yeah.
It's funny how that sentiment translates.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And during that period, there was what's also fascinating. There was one party rule. So the LDP, which is the Liberal Democratic Party, was in power for almost 40 years, right up until the 1990s.
That sounds like aggressively democratic.
Yeah.
That sounds very democratic. Yeah, of course.
It was. And obviously this party was very pro-capitalist,
Yep.
had a very cozy relationship with the major corporations that emerged in Japan. Mm-hmm. And obviously that kind of instilled a very corrupt political system.
Yeah.
Awash with lots of capital, so it was very difficult for any party, and still is to this day, to actually get into the electoral system and compete with the LDP.
Yeah.
And so what happened, though, is that heaps of money was put into the housing market, and it became very financialised.
Yeah.
Does that ring any bells?
Sounds vaguely familiar. Yeah. Getting closer to home.
Yeah. So the real estate, the increase in the price of real estate became so big that during the 1990s, the Emperor's Palace in Tokyo was valued at more than the entire Chinese GDP.
Wow. So obviously no one was buying it, but that was the speculative value.
Yeah,
that is
correct.
Wild, dude. That is wild.
And the economy collapsed partially in the 1990s. So the stock market lost 50% of its value. The massive bubble that had been just stimulated, the housing market collapsed. People lost their homes. And the government obviously bailed out the banks, injected massive stimulus into the economy. And that breakdown, they've sort of never recovered from. It sort of has created a very weak structure within the Japanese economy.
So have they pretty much been in just like a stable form of recession?
And stagnation and very slow growth, that's right. But also the Plaza Accords that we previously mentioned, that kind of was like the first pin that burst the economy. And then obviously you had the stock market crash, another pin that burst it, and they haven't been able to recover since.
Well, how does that affect your average Japanese worker? Obviously, you're there like as a tourist. But did you notice? Could you kind of get any ideas of what the average Japanese worker in the big cities? How that affects them and what their economic situation is like personally.
So I don't really have much kind of anecdotal stories to provide. It was more from my readings and from those readings I kind of found out the most information. So in Japan, they have a ruthless working culture. Their working conditions and culture is quite terrible. People work really, really long hours, and it's kind of incentivized within the system, obviously, that kind of admiration to authority. So people work really long hours and they don't really demand pay rises, and it's kind of become a part of the culture that you don't take lots of your annual leave and sick leave, and it's so grossly competitive that one thing I was reading was about foreigners coming there and trying to get jobs inside the Japanese economy, and they said like just to break into it was just horrible. Like it's not something you want to do. No, it's obviously forced upon their working class. They have to put up with it.
Yeah. But like you said, it's almost kind of, at this stage, it's kind of culturally instilled.
Yeah, that's right.
To a certain extent, where it's perfectly acceptable to work 17 hours a day, fall asleep at your office desk, and just rinse and repeat.
That's exactly right. So that working culture and working conditions is pretty bad.
Yeah.
So
but
once...
Jordie, they have anime. What are you talking about?
That is true. So after the LDP kind of lost majority during the 90s, you had the... You had multiple kind of coalition governments, minority governments kind of vying for power back and forth. And the opposition party, all these parties, they have so you have like, so it's the Constitutional Democratic Party of Japan, not the Liberal Democratic Party of Japan. They came to power in 2010. Which was not a good year to come to power in Japan.
No.
Because 1 year later, a massive earthquake rocked Japan, followed by a tsunami and a nuclear meltdown.
Of course.
And so 2 years later, they were voted out.
Yeah. Well, that'll do it.
Yeah, that will do it.
Nuclear catastrophe will absolutely do it. Yep.
And then since then, the LDP has been back in power, surprise, surprise, and that has not helped with the system of corruption. They've had major electoral reforms that over the past 10 years, just try and get corruption and money out of the electoral system, like banning donations and stuff. There's so many loopholes in it that it's...
Of course.
And there's heaps of gerrymandering, and the entire political system it's very similar to America.
Yeah.
So much so that I was looking at the voter turnout, and these numbers were astonishing.
So it's not like Australia where it's mandatory.
Correct.
Mandatory voting.
It's like the US, surprise, surprise. The US kind of basically wrote their entire constitution and electoral system.
And obviously, as we know, the US is the most democratic nation on earth.
So it's not surprising that they have a very similar system where capital dominates the electoral system.
That being said as well, would it be safe to say they have a similar undercurrent of, say, like social isolation, for example, and alienation from the broader community because it is so focused on those kind of consumerist aspects, like that hyper-consumerist hustle grind culture. And I guess maybe that, because what I'm thinking of is the assassination recently, or it's about a year and a bit ago, of Shinzo Abe.
Correct, yes.
Yes, who was the Prime Minister, I believe, who was assassinated by a disgruntled citizen.
Yes.
So obviously people aren't happy about this.
No.
And there is a lot of, like a bit of an undercurrent of discontent amongst the electorate.
Correct. There definitely is. I don't think people are a bit disconnected, though, and they're not really mobilised or organised. So the voter turnout in the United States is roughly, usually on average, over 60%.
Yeah.
I think just recently it was upwards about 62, 64%. In Japan, they were getting at about 70% 2010. That's now dropped to just over 50%, which is a massive drop.
Yeah.
And young people aged between 18 and 20, it's only about 34% of people actually vote.
Oh, wow. Goodness.
And people over 60, the turnout's at about 64%. The problem is, with an ageing population, less and less people are going to register to vote because their older population is dying off.
Yep. And obviously declining birth rates as well. That has a whole nother kind of economic factor to it, essentially.
That's exactly right. And what you touched upon before about the isolation is that Japan kept a lot of their like feudal social relations and kind of layered capitalism on top of that, which created a very interesting society, but also quite brutal in some ways.
Yeah, I can imagine.
So that kind of respect to authority, and they've kept that kind of very paternalistic family kind of connection. So there's not a lot of births outside of marriage. Once marriages collapse, it's kind of you just sort of like live with inside a collapsed marriage. You don't kind of remarry afterwards. So, yeah.
So, but like you're saying, like the political culture is pretty stagnant.
It's very stagnant.
There's not much like political room for growth and for innovation.
That's right,
correct.
correct. Yes, and even inside their economy. So what I've been listening to and reading is that there's this weird kind of like technological stagnation as well. And I saw this firsthand. So if you go onto the Japanese websites on your phone, like you imagine there's kind of this idea that in Japan that they're living in like the future and like kind of cyberpunk. And on one level there is some things like that. But you just go onto their websites. Like if you want to book a train, their websites are like what LimeWire was in like 2004. Or like MSN Messenger. It's like really basic.
Yeah, right.
Which is, so there's this kind of real kind of like disconnect between some parts of the economy and other parts.
Yeah.
So
where do you think that'll lead Japan? Because like what you've kind of said in your analysis is that obviously the current state of Japan in the post-war era, kind of leading up to now, it was obviously reinforced and bolstered by the United States, primarily given massive amounts of money for reconstruction and kind of politically directed in a certain orientation, obviously similar to like Western Europe after the Second World War, to kind of counteract the menace, shall we say, of the Eastern Bloc of China and the Soviet Union, obviously.
Correct.
So how do you think that'll go going into the future now that those geopolitical realities don't exist anymore? Because obviously we've seen that the US isn't, even though they've used Japan, they're not allies because they helped crash their economy and lead them to the current crisis they're in now.
Correct. Hang on a sec.
Yes.
That's what the US does with all its allies.
No, but Jordie, we're a US ally.
So, okay,
times.
We'll keep this brief.
Yep.
Two things that I think is very important to look at.
Yep.
There's over 56,000 US troops stationed in Japan at the moment.
Yep.
They are going to play a significant role in the emerging and current Cold War between the United States and China. Yep. Massive role. Because obviously you have the Okinawa chain, island chain, all down the south of Japan. That is where the US has been building a new military facility and bases, and they are placing medium to long-range missile systems. The famous ATACMS missile system are going to be placed there.
Yep.
And they're going to use that as kind of lily pads to contain China, and if there is a confrontation over Taiwan, that will be a launching base for the US.
Yep.
Japan falls under the US nuclear umbrella. So basically, like, we will military occupy you, but at the same time, we'll provide you defense. So there is like no defense spending. However, that's just changed in the past few years. So the US is obviously behind the doors pressuring them now.
Yeah.
And there's domestic kind of it plays into the kind of domestic political kind of environment that there's now a big push to remilitarize.
Yes. So again, in the context of Japanese history, like a very quick and rapid rush towards military industrialization didn't really end well last time.
No,
for the Japanese.
That's right.
Yeah,
correct.
So are people aware of this? Like, are there Japanese anti-war protesters or
no, there's not.
Is there protests towards essentially what is US occupation? I know there is in Korea.
Yeah,
obviously they have they have a different history to Japan.
What I've seen is there's little pockets of it. I did see a documentary about, but it was mainly older Japanese that were protesting against this. It was like old women going out in buses in Okinawa and protesting against this.
Dude, actually, the backbone of the protest movement is middle-aged women everywhere. 100%. No, seriously, that is so true. We could not do anything without them.
No, I totally agree.
I'm not being condescending.
No, I know you are. It's a good observation. So yeah, they're kind of falling into, I guess, that kind of being used as a pawn in the emerging Cold War between the US and China. And second of all, something, and I think this is really important, is I noticed there is no Chinese cars in Japan. There's no foreign cars. There is only Japanese cars.
Well, look, we can't complain about that.
No, so there's obviously
Toyotas and Subarus and Nissans are
correct.
pretty good.
Except, and I thought this was interesting, is that obviously they have massive tariffs.
Yes.
On Chinese cars. I saw one Tesla there and a couple of like Mercedes-Benz. What's interesting though is they're finding it harder and harder to compete with the Chinese.
Yeah.
And what the Japanese lack is, and this is similar to the Germans, and I'm borrowing this analysis a little bit from Yanis Varoufakis, and he said this, is they lack any sort of cloud capital. So you think about the big tech firms, they are in China and the US.
Yeah.
They are the ones that have access to the hardware and the software to create these mega clouds for, like, for example, your Amazon, Alibaba, all those kinds of major corporations.
Your Ubers, your Spotify.
Correct, that's right.
Yeah,
None of that exists inside Japan, at all. So their car industry, as what's happening in Germany now, finding it very difficult to compete globally, pretty much can't. And they invested all their money into the combustion engine and like hybrid cars.
Yep.
And the engineering, and I was actually listening to a German speak about this, is it also comes from like a level of kind of engineering arrogance as well.
Yes.
Is they thought they would refine the internal combustion so much, it would become so efficient that electric cars would be just kind of like a spontaneous thing that some people have, but the internal combustion would stick around forever.
The backbone.
That's right. And they did not see what was going to happen with electric cars. They weren't quick enough to adapt and change their industry. And I think it's going to come to bite them. Just in the UK, it was Nissan shut down one of its plants and cut about 9,000 workers. So,
oh, wow. The UK is going down even further then?
Well, no, so that was Nissan.
Yep.
Yeah.
In the United Kingdom.
In the United Kingdom.
Yes, of course, yeah.
So
it's interesting that you do say that as well, because when typically me growing up, when you mentioned a Japanese product or a German product, it's just synonymous with like precision, sophistication that, a troglodyte Australian like myself would not be able to comprehend. You know what I mean? But it's interesting how that is now losing relevance again, and it shows that they are, like you said, that arrogance, they are failing to innovate and step forward.
And adapt and kind of overcome. And that was, as you said, that was true from the 1990s to the 2000s. And now obviously we're seeing a massive shift. So, an interesting place, a very interesting history.
Yep.
And
incredible history.
It is, yeah.
And you got like sushi, bullet trains, ramen, like Shibu Inus. There's heaps of good shit about Japan. Pardon my language.
Really fast trains, 300k an hour bullet trains. Incredible.
Do you reckon we could learn something from the Japanese in terms of public transport?
We could learn a lot. Not that we will actually do anything about it, but we could learn a lot.
Yeah.
I think all the Australian politicians should just be forced, all policymakers should be forced to just be stuck on a high-speed rail train for like 24 hours straight.
I don't think they'd comprehend. I think like a Barnaby Joyce type character, I think his head would melt.
Yeah.
He would spontaneously combust before actually being able to comprehend what he was doing.
Yeah. So, no, it was a good trip, and it's good to be back.
Oh, beautiful, mate. I appreciate that report, Jordie.
Yeah. So, as you mentioned earlier at the beginning of the podcast, a lot has happened. I've been sort of stuck in a little Japanese bubble for the past few weeks, but a lot's been going on. A government collapsed?
Mate, Jordie bloke, it's not every day a state falls apart in front of you. Like, it has happened historically quite a bit, obviously. We are, of course, talking about the Syrian government, so the Syrian Arab Republic, which was led by the Syrian Ba'ath Party, headed by Bashar al-Assad. He's been in power for, I think, since about 2001, after the passing away of his father, Hafez al-Assad, and the death of his older brother, who was originally meant to take charge. So, if you've been watching the news... and I was lamenting while you're away because I needed someone to talk to about this. If you've been watching the news, maybe tune into Channel 7 or something like that, you would have seen over the last couple of weeks these just jubilant headlines reporting on the collapse of a brutal dictatorship.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, democracy rings through, the Syrian rebels have captured Damascus, and the hated Bashar al-Assad has fled to Russia, where his evil crony Putin has been giving him shelter, etc., etc.
I was going to say, I did see an ABC headline, and it was just like, the Assad regime has collapsed.
So there's a lot of things at play here, and I think in order to provide a comprehensive analysis, you can't just look at it one way, because it's a couple things. So obviously it is, if the Syrian people were really in a position to where they were going to back the Assad regime any further, they would have done it.
Yep.
If the geopolitical powers, like if the other states in the area were in a position where that was beneficial to them, they would have backed it. And if the Assad government was in a position where they could have held power feasibly, they would have, again, stayed in power.
Yep.
But it's just reductive to look at it as just a heroic revolution and a heroic resistance struggle that has succeeded. I think...
Well, yeah, because that's really how the media has been trying to frame it, hasn't
exactly.
it? Yeah.
And the media leaves out a lot of things. So I'll try to...
As they usually do.
So I'll try to give a bit of a kind of background to the whole situation. This can be seen, in my opinion, as the tail end of the Syrian civil war, which essentially kicked off in 2011. So there was a civil war in the loosest terms, in that it was a war fought between factions inside the state borders of the Syrian Arab Republic. However, you could also look at it as a regime change operation that might have stagnated for a little bit, but has now finally come into fruition with its intended outcome of overthrowing the regime of Bashar al-Assad.
Yep.
So what has happened is, in the Middle East, there has essentially been almost not necessarily a coalition, but there's always been a strong grouping of states that have been anti-imperialist and nominally independent.
Yep.
So we can look at countries like, notably, I think Libya, I think Palestine, definitely, Iran being the big prize at the end of the day, Iraq under Saddam Hussein, even though his rise to power was incredibly sketchy, and he was a CIA man at one stage, but as soon as he started going against the will of the imperial hegemon, he was ousted. And lastly, Bashar al-Assad in Syria. So there's a few factors, and we look at all of those countries, well, where are they now? In complete chaos. The things these countries had in common, they were all supporters of the Palestinian struggle. They were all nominally independent. Lots of them weren't tied into the kind of global trade network of the IMF and the World Bank, for etc. Lots of them were oil sufficient, oil exporters, and also food sufficient. So one by one, they've been ticked off the list. I want to show you a quick clip, and this is from the US General Wesley Clark. It goes for about 2 minutes, and a fair few people have seen this, but this is just around the time of the Iraq invasion in 2003.
About 10 days after 9/11, I went through the Pentagon and I saw Secretary Rumsfeld and Deputy Secretary Wolfowitz. I went downstairs just to say hello to some of the people on the Joint Staff who had used to work for me, and one of the generals called me and he said, "Sir, you got to come in. You got to come in and talk to me a second." I said, "Well, you're too busy." He said, "No." He says, "We've made the decision. We're going to war with Iraq." This was on or about the 20th of September. I said, "We're going to war with Iraq. Why?" He said, "I don't know." He said, "I guess they don't know what else to do." So I said, "Well, did they find some information connecting Saddam to al-Qaeda?" He said, No. He says, "There's nothing new that way. They've just made the decision to go to war with Iraq." He said, "I guess it's like we don't know what to do about terrorists, but we got a good military and we can take down governments. And he said, I guess if the only tool you have is a hammer, every problem has to look like a nail. So I came back to see him a few weeks later, and by that time we were bombing in Afghanistan. I said, are we still going to war with Iraq? And he said, oh, it's worse than that. He said, he reached over on his desk, he picked up a piece of paper, and he said, I just got this down from upstairs, meaning the Secretary of Defense's office today, and he said, this is a memo that describes how we're going to take out 7 countries in 5 years, starting with Iraq and then Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and finishing off Iran.
So there's Wes Clark laying it all out on the eve of the invasion of Iraq. And I think the reason pardon me, yeah.
He was previously the head of NATO, was he not? He was one of the...
I'm not sure if it was NATO or if it was like the US General Command in Europe.
Yeah,
so the defeat of Serbia, he was the man spearheading that whole
But it's
operation.
rare to have an inside voice and perspective about this.
No.
Yeah, they break it down.
Yeah,
and just tell you exactly what's happening.
He's not even saying the quiet part out loud. He's saying, like, this is a huge issue.
Yeah.
And that's why I'm trying to lay this context, because you have to look at the bigger picture of not just as an independent pro-democracy revolution, although we'll get to that later, but of how this fits into, the wider picture of these pieces being ticked off. So, I guess for more modern context, Syrian civil war kicked off in about 2011 after the Arab Spring. The Arab Spring was essentially a series of popular uprisings in Middle Eastern nations, so notably Egypt, like Tunisia, Bahrain, the Gulf states, funnily enough, like your Qatars and your Saudi Arabias were, for some reason,
all the US allies,
all the US allies and all the ones that kind of engineered it, they were immune to this popular uprising, even though they are possibly the most anti-democratic and despotic of all of them. Notably, they toppled the Mubarak regime in Egypt. I do remember that happening, and they had Mohammed Morsi of the Muslim Brotherhood in for about a year or two. He was then assassinated and replaced by essentially Mubarak II, who's al-Sisi, who's the current leader of Egypt. When these protests kicked off in Syria, lots of Syrians actually had good reason to protest because it was a one-party state led by a dictator. Not many political freedoms. So lots of things we take for granted here in Australia, they did not have there. However, it did have a lot of other things which are missing in Middle Eastern states today. It had, equal rights for men and women. It had equal rights for all religions. And it was a secular state. They were food independent, fuel independent. They had independent weapons industry, independent pharmaceutical industry. Like I said, independent agriculture.
What you're describing to me is a sovereign state.
An
independent,
nominally sovereign
state.
Obviously, they were always allied with Russia. Due to, I think, kind of history in the Cold War. They were screwed over by Americans in diplomacy, and then Hafez al-Assad was just like never again.
Correct, but as I guess kind of it wasn't like a basket case.
No,
as what is now kind of stereotypically prescribed to Middle Eastern countries.
Yes, and like all the Middle Eastern countries that have been overthrown in these kind of liberal interventions or neoconservative interventions since September the 11th, it has since become a basket case. They have all become absolute failed states, essentially. Libya is a failed state. Iraq, barely functioning.
So, beginning of the Civil War, 2011, after the Arab Spring.
The Arab Spring. So there was protests which were, to some extent, suppressed by the government and security forces, but also in a playbook that was also used in Ukraine, you had a lot of heavily armed sectarian groups, incredibly violent, killing lots of security forces and starting to kind of band together as, kind of militia groups, causing chaos all over the country. I think it's important to note that after the Iraq War, this is kind of at the tail end of the mainstream, the kind of the US occupation as a whole, you had, for example, groups like Al-Qaeda. So around this same time, you had groups that started popping up like Al-Qaeda originally in Iraq, and then they popped up in Syria. You had ISIS, again, popped up in Syria. So I had all these rebel groups that were strangely well-funded and strangely well-equipped and armed, starting to wage open war against the Syrian government. Notably, so we've got like Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which became Jabhat al-Nusra, which has since become Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which is the new leading government. We'll get to that later. You always had ISIS, for example. So that preceded like a brutal civil war in which the government of Assad was almost taken out of power. They received help from Hezbollah, Iranian forces, and also the Russians, and they eventually started taking back the majority of the Syrian nation, it pretty much got down to what was essentially Kurdish separatist forces backed by the United States, occupying about a third of the country in the northeast, and the province of Idlib just below Turkey. So this is where I'm going to start talking about some of the other powers, the other countries at play, and how their interests intersect.
Yeah.
And I'm going to put that on top.
What I was just going to say is you don't have to take our word for these kind of nefarious terrorist organisations popping up and being funded.
No.
We actually have a great clip from the political advisor and economist Jeffrey Sachs on MSNBC, who breaks this down quite succinctly and has not been invited back on corporate media ever since.
They sent in the CIA to overthrow Assad. The CIA and Saudi Arabia together in covert operations tried to overthrow Assad. It was a disaster. Eventually it brought in both ISIS as a splinter group to the jihadists that went in. It also brought in Russia. So we have been digging deeper and deeper and deeper. What we should do now is get out and not continue to throw missiles, not have a confrontation with Russia. 7 years has been a disaster under Obama, continuing under Trump. This is what I would call the permanent state. This is the CIA, this is Pentagon, wanting to keep Iran and Russia out of Syria, but no way to do that. And so we have made a proxy war in Syria. It's killed 500,000 people, displaced 10 million, and I'll say predictably so, because I predicted it 7 years ago that there was no way to do this and that it would make a complete chaos. So what I would plead to President Trump is get out, like his instinct told him, by the way. That was his instinct. But then all the establishment, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Pentagon, everybody said, no, that's irresponsible. But his instinct is right. Get out. We've done enough damage, 7 years. And now we really risk a confrontation with Russia that is extraordinarily dangerous, reckless.
Professor Sachs is correct to say this is a massive humanitarian disaster. I think the numbers are actually 600,000 dead and 14 million displaced. So I'm in complete agreement with him on the scale of this, but I would like to see the United States try and be part of the solution.
I don't think it's attractive, but I think we have to understand how this happened. This happened because of us. These 600,000 are not just incidental. We started a war to overthrow a regime. It was covert. It was Timber Sycamore. People can look it up, the CIA operation, together with Saudi Arabia. Still it's shrouded in secrecy, which is part of the problem in our country. A major war effort shrouded in secrecy, never debated by Congress, never explained to the American people, signed by President Obama, never explained. And this created chaos. And so just throwing more missiles in right now is not a response.
My only concern...
We need to go, it's, by the way, not to walk away, to go to the UN Security Council, as the Admiral says, to agree with Russia on a strategy for ending the fight. But ending the fight means that we stop trying to overthrow a government, that we stop trying to support rebels who are committed to overthrowing the government. That is where this war continues, because we, to this day, back rebels that are trying to overthrow a government contrary to international law, contrary to the UN Charter, contrary to common sense, contrary to practical path. We can't do it. And it's just creating ongoing crisis to the extent of facing an imminent confrontation with Russia.
That was obviously Jeffrey Sachs being as prescient as ever, and that was probably from about 2018 or so, I'd imagine, that clip. Yeah.
Can I say one thing? Interesting point.
Yeah.
Proxy war, Russia, 500,000 people dead, nuclear confrontation. It's eerie. It's eerie, isn't it?
This playbook just keeps playing out.
Yeah.
I wonder what it is. Specifically, so funnily enough, what the man Jeff is referring to in terms of the CIA operation, they ran an operation called Operation Timber Sycamore, where they were funding the Syrian rebels. There has since been, on the WikiLeaks leaked Hillary Clinton's emails and kind of various investigations, it has since been revealed that these rebel groups weren't really these kind of independent rebels. It was mainly ISIS and Al-Qaeda. Not only that, but they knew that it was ISIS and Al-Qaeda, pardon me, and they continued to fund and arm them. Not only was it the CIA, you had the Saudis, you had the Gulf states, the UAE, you had Qatar, you had Turkey. Qatar specifically had actually interests because they had a plan to build a pipeline across Syria from Qatar to Turkey. This was known as the Qatar-Turkey pipeline. The idea has since was scrapped, but the idea was they were going to give the Syrian government, obviously, proceeds for having this pipeline. However, this would have undermined the profitability and the viability of Syria's ally, Russia, of their Nord Stream pipeline, because it would have given an alternative supply of gas to Europe. So, and it's funny, again, how these things are relevant today more than ever. But the Syrians said, no, we have a deal with the Russians. We're not going to stab our allies in the back, and so we reject it.
Yep.
That has all since played out with the war ensuing afterwards. It's estimated that between the Saudis, the Gulf states as a whole, Israel, we cannot forget Israel because they have had a very, very dirty role to play. The US and Turkey, they have spent $200 billion US over the course of 13 years. $200 billion. That is a colossal amount of money to do exactly what Jeffrey Sachs said, displace 10 million, kill hundreds of thousands. The Turks specifically, they essentially, the province of Idlib, which was annexed by the Turkish-backed HTS, who have been the faction that have most recently come into power in Syria, they had a strategy of essentially getting Turkic people from all over the world, so like Kazakhs, Uzbeks, Turks, even Uyghurs from China. They had a big role to play in the fostering of Islamic extremism in China, which is also very relevant. Brought them all to Idlib, and for the last couple of years, they've essentially been, incubating a terrorist breeding ground, shall we say, for the really worst of the worst people. These are the kind of people that relish in sectarian violence. They, like Jabhat al-Nusra, for example, HTS now, they were known to lock Christians in cages and drown them, bisect women and hang them from trees.
Horrible stuff.
The worst stuff you can ever imagine.
It's fascinating. I was just going to say, these are the kind of stereotypical Muslim caricatures that are demonized here in the West, except it was the West that was funding these groups and using them to destabilize their enemies.
Yes, exactly.
It's funny how that works.
They're trying to destabilize, nations like Syria, were the moderate, pretty progressive in terms of what we would consider progressive.
Very secular nations as well.
Very secular nations for Middle Eastern states. So there was a lot of, heaps of shit happened, pardon my language, over that period of time. You had, for example, the chemical weapons attacks or alleged chemical weapons attacks by the Assad government. There is a book, The Killing of Osama bin Laden, written by Seymour Hersh, who details this greatly and details how it was most likely not the Syrian government, it was most likely these Turkish and Saudi-backed terrorist groups that were manufacturing chemical weapons. After Bashar al-Assad destroyed their chemical weapons stockpile, you had more false flags, or alleged false flags, in 2018 specifically. There's been leaks from the OPCW, which is the kind of world's chemical weapons watchdog, which has been very thoroughly covered by Aramatov of the Grey Zone, for example. That has kind of cast a lot of light, because all of these were used as pretexts to have more Western intervention in Syria. Barack Obama came out himself and said the red line for US intervention is chemical weapons. And then 2 weeks later, there's a chemical weapons attack. It's it's pretty blatant. I think when you look if you kind of have a bit of a more critical view of it, it becomes very obvious. It becomes painfully obvious, shall I say. That being said, all this I cannot use all this to justify denying Syrians their autonomy, because obviously there was so many issues with Bashar al-Assad and lots of Syrian people didn't want him.
So this civil war waged on, and then what caused it to wrap up?
Well, essentially there was, shall we say, kind of a stagnation where ISIS were essentially defeated. The Russians and the Americans, funnily enough, under Trump, both kind of started working together. So whereas beforehand, the Americans had been acting as ISIS's air force, for example, bombing Syrian government positions, destroying air defense systems, for example, they started actually fighting ISIS nominally, I think the Russians and the Iranians, Iraqi militias and Hezbollah did most of it. They kind of defeated ISIS and they pushed Nusra/HDS back into this Idlib province, which borders Turkey. And then you had a series of peace kind of negotiations and accords since then, kind of collectively known as like the Astana kind of peace process.
Yep.
So let's skip to about 3 weeks ago.
So what caused this all to collapse?
Well, what happened? There's been a series of developments since about 2017 to 18 onwards. The first thing is the sanctions levied upon Syria by the US government. Again, the US military, via their Kurdish proxies, are already occupying all of Syria's oil fields and all of their wheat fields.
Yep.
A large portion of Syrian water, their water resources, is in the Israeli-occupied Golan Heights.
Yep.
The Syrian government has been denied any resources or money to actually start rebuilding the country. So the country has economically stagnated, which again leads to corruption, leads to
an anemic state.
Shall we say, where over time, I think kind of short term and with enough support and with enough education, like we've seen in Cuba, for example, the people are not going to, they know it's an imperialist venture and they're not going to get overthrown. But given the kind of sectarian nature and the large nature of the country and how many different kind of vultures are picking away at it, I think the state started to break down. And it's one of those things that when you analyse it all and you look back afterwards, you go, well, of course it happened. But before it happened, no one was really kind of predicting it. However, it's very funny because there's been numerous recorded instances where these Salafi jihadists, like ISIS and Al-Qaeda, for etc., kind of worked alongside Israel, shall we say?
Yes.
So, for example, there was a very funny moment where I think ISIS accidentally launched a rocket over into Israel. They landed in Israel somewhere, and they very quickly came out with a statement apologising. Yeah, sorry, our bad, that one, of course. The Israelis kind of looked at them and were like, all good, I'll forgive you on this one, carry on. Other times where they've had wounded soldiers that have been evacuated into the Golan Heights for Israeli medical treatment. And you'd think that a sectarian, head-chopping Salafi, Takfiri jihadist, the thing that they would hate the most would be Jews.
Yep.
No, they do not. They do not seem to hate Israelis the most. They seem to hate Shias the most. Funnily enough, Hezbollah and Iran, the enemies of Israel and the US. Just a bit of context.
It's a coincidence.
It's all coincidental, I swear. But look, what's happened, another juicy coincidence, was the day after Hezbollah and Israel signed their ceasefire agreement. This was just like 3 weeks ago.
Yes.
The day after me and Habiba did our last pod and we're talking about how there wasn't going to be a ceasefire, the Israelis caved because they were getting their bums handed to them in southern Lebanon. And they announced a ceasefire, which Hezbollah agreed to. The next day, there was a massive breakout offensive by the HTS forces from the Idlib province. They very quickly, in a matter of about 8 or 9 days in total, captured Aleppo, Hama, Homs, and Damascus.
Yep.
Pardon me, with a shockingly small amount of resistance from the Syrian Arab army. So, funnily enough, they were using new types of warfare that the Syrians weren't prepared for. They were using drone warfare. They, funnily enough, had Ukrainian officers directing some of their offences and, again, orchestrating these kind of drone assaults, which has become popularised and has kind of become standard for modern warfare, as we've seen from the Russia-Ukraine war. And we essentially saw the will to fight amongst the Syrian Arab army evaporate. We saw the will of the people to, again, support Assad evaporate. And we saw, I think, Assad's mandate to rule evaporate all within about a week or so.
Yep.
Heaps of factors. I think one of the main ones is the economic sanctions, because there has just been so much poverty and so much hardship for your average Syrian that, look, we just want something different.
Yeah.
And I think even for Assad himself, I think
he basically just gave up towards the end.
I think it was the kind of thing where he tried to, for example, about a year or two ago, they let him back into the Arab League, like the Gulf states. And so I think he tried to bridge the gap with the Gulf states that had betrayed him and tried to kind of moderate his position. For example, I've seen reports recently where they talked about, he had some of his generals saying we should open up a front against Israel while they're fighting Lebanon and Hezbollah, support the resistance. And he just said, no, I don't want to do that. We can't, I can't afford to do that politically. And I think after that much time, you've tried I personally do not think he was a malicious, evil man like his neighbour to the southwest, Benjamin Netanyahu.
Yeah.
I think it was probably just a man who was just not qualified for the job,
Yeah.
hung on for as long as he could, and at the end of the day was, just threw in the towel, I guess.
Yeah.
And the sad thing about that is that this is going to lead to, would I have expected him to hang around and him and his family all get, strung up and hung? No,
Yeah, no.
of course. But the sad thing about that is that the state of Syria that we have recognised and known is no longer.
Yeah, so he has since fled and been granted political asylum in Moscow, Russia.
Yep, to where he says he's going to go back to practicing as an orthodontist, which was his original trade. If you're ever in Moscow and you get in a cab, you might have Bashar al-Assad driving.
He doesn't fit the caricature of a dictator, does he?
Doesn't.
He does not.
He really doesn't.
Yeah. So the Syrian state collapsed in a little under 3 weeks.
Yeah.
This new group, HTS, has taken power.
Yes.
Can you tell me a little bit about HTS and who they are?
HTS are fantastic.
Yep.
That was a joke, obviously. No. So HTS are called a group called Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. Pardon my monolinguistic Australian pronunciation of the beautiful Arab language. They're essentially a rebranded, a rebrand of the group called Jabhat al-Nusra, who were themselves a rebrand of Al-Qaeda, and they kind of spun out of ISIS as well.
Yep.
So they have really wholesome, progressive views, obviously, being a spin-off of ISIS and Al-Qaeda.
Yep.
And
they sound like a group that can govern a country.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. So, again, they're one of these groups who have just mysteriously, got billions and billions of dollars of weaponry.
Yep.
One of the reasons that it's theorised they were able to overtake the Syrian Arab army so quickly, it's estimated that a HTS recruit, so if you're some dude in Uzbekistan, you really like Islamic extremism, you could go to Idlib via Turkey, the Turkish intelligence would get you there, and they'll pay like $2,000 a month US to fight for HTS, compared to the Syrian Arab army soldiers who were getting, I believe an officer was getting $40 a month and a conscript was getting $7 a month.
Wow.
So it's pretty dire.
The difference is incredible.
It is incredible.
$2,000 a month is a lot in the Middle East.
Well, it's a lot for most of the world.
Yeah.
That's it. 2,000 US. It's a crazy amount of money. So back to the leader of HTS is this man whose name is Abu Muhammad al-Jalani.
Yep.
So it's not actually his name. He was born Ahmed Hussein al-Shara. So he originally came out, he was an extremist. He went and fought in Iraq. He was captured by the US forces. He spent some time in Abu Ghraib, I believe.
Yep.
And he spent most of his time alongside the gentleman who would go on to found ISIS, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, in the US-controlled Kurdish autonomous region of Iraq. So funnily enough, all these guys come out of this, the Americans just let them go, and they go on to, funnily enough, just go along with US directives.
It's an interesting coincidence. Yes. They will end up in US prisons.
This whole thing is shocking.
And then they're all released, and then they all go on to become leaders of these groups and gain very strong positions, and even now run governments.
Yeah. Amazing. He spent years in prison. So he, again, Nusra and he was kind of a spin-off from ISIS, but they were just known as being really violent sectarian arseholes, should I say, and Syria is quite a ethnically diverse regions. They were committing horrible sectarian violence on ethnic and religious lines. Although, Jordie, he has been rebranded and presented in such a way, it is incredible. I think that I'm going to show a video here, and you can look at this man and tell me that he is not incredibly sophisticated. And you can also wonder why on earth CNN is interviewing this guy who is the leader of an Islamic extremist movement. Let's watch.
Once that task is complete, it will transition to a state of governance, institutions, and so on. I believe that everyone in life goes through phases and experiences, and these experiences naturally increase a person's awareness. A person in their 20s will have a different personality than someone in their 30s or 40s, and certainly someone in their 50s.
So are those days behind you?
Sometimes it's essential to adjust to reality, and because someone who rigidly clings to certain ideas and principles without flexibility cannot effectively lead societies or navigate complex conflicts like the one happening in Syria.
People listening to this are going to wonder why they should believe you. You are still a specially designated global terrorist by the United States.
Well, hang on a second. It sounds like he's reformed his life and he's turned himself around.
Absolutely, man.
Yeah.
Honestly, he sounds like a moderate. I believe it was the Daily Telegraph actually called him diversity friendly.
Yes,
So they're going
yes.
to be leading not only the Islamic Revolution, but the LGBTQA plus revolution in the Middle East single-handedly by Jordie. But one thing I thought was really funny when I first started seeing these videos of him, I thought he actually looks a lot like someone else we know. Who is that man? A man also who has been at the front of a proxy war for the last 2 years, Zelensky. So he has, I can only assume his handler, his CIA handler, is also Zelensky's handler. Either that or maybe they took some notes from Zelensky, because he's really going for that kind of moderate Fidel Castro, camo fatigue
Correct.
kind of look. But
That's
look,
right. Well, I was going to say he is mimicking that kind of the military fatigue,
Exactly.
which Zelensky was then mimicking of Fidel Castro.
Exactly.
That's right.
And I don't think Fidel Castro would have
Correct.
condoned either of these gentlemen.
Speaking of middle-aged women earlier, who do middle-aged women all love? Fidel Castro.
Fidel Castro, of course.
Yes.
So, of course, they've got to be flocking to Jelani.
Yeah.
But it's because he said so much. It's hilarious. He's said so much about, like, diversity is strength. He's echoed these kind of Hillary Clinton talking points. Diversity is strength. We must embrace a diverse culture, which is all actually really digestible and quite appealing to me, someone who thinks that, again, this incredible multicultural society that is Syria and how that can be embraced.
Yep.
It is not, however, reflected in the actions of his soldiers. So they've
Yes.
stormed Damascus, they've taken the country. I've seen videos of the Alawite minority sect, who were a minority ethno-religious group that Assad actually belonged to originally. I have
Yep.
seen videos of them getting executed as they have, HTS
Yeah.
has taken Latakia.
One other question. Al-Jilani, was there not a quite a large sum of money?
There was a very large sum of money. So just to demonstrate his, shall we say, checkered past,
Yes.
I want to chuck a photo up on the screen so we can all see, but this is his wanted poster. So the US State Department, and you can see Jelani there, and see how he's changed? He's gone from having turban, long beard,
Osama bin Laden
and then he's gone from Osama bin Laden
to Fidel Castro.
to Fidel Castro.
Yes.
All the mums are they were scared of him beforehand, and
Yeah.
now the liberal mums are swooning over him.
Yeah.
The thing is, though, this is actually quite amusing, because they're offering up to $10 million. This is from a couple of years ago, to locate Jelani.
So you had a $10 million bounty on his
Yes,
head.
while another part of their imperialist octopus was arming and training and funding him via the Turks. So they had $10 million reward. I don't think they've taken this down yet. So if anyone from the US State Department is watching, I have a suspicion he's in Damascus. Please hit me up.
Well, I was
Left
saying-
Hook Media needs the
I was
cash.
going to say, we could potentially use this money.
I think so.
Okay.
Definitely. Absolutely wild stuff.
Yes. So going forwards,
Yep.
the country has, well, the previous state under Bashar al-Assad has collapsed within
Yep.
3 weeks.
Yep.
There's really no kind of central government in Syria. There is now this different groups of militias led by HTS and Fidel Castro.
Yep.
What happens next? What do you think is going to happen? Because hasn't Israel now also launched an invasion into Syria and began to annex parts of the country?
Yes, and the plot just keeps thickening. So Israel actually has, I'd say them primarily. So the Turks, I believe, have these kind of neo-Ottoman got like dreams, I guess, like Erdogan's wet dreams of just expanding the Ottoman Empire. So
Yep.
they want to occupy the kind of northern Idlib and Aleppo section. Pardon me. funnily, just a small side tangent, when they originally dropped Sykes-Picot to cut up the Ottoman Empire in the Middle East, originally Aleppo was going to be part of Turkey.
Yep.
But then I think the British and the French, for whatever reason, were just like, no, you're not having that.
Yep.
You've got the Turks, want their sphere of influence. The Kurds and their US backers are still occupying the oil-rich regions of the northeast. And this is where it gets so stupid, because the Kurds are considered by the Turks a terrorist organisation.
Yes.
So the Kurdish forces, who are the Syrian Democratic Forces, that's what they've been dubbed in Syria, they're currently fighting the Turks, even though they both work together to achieve the hegemonic goals of the US and Israel.
Yeah.
Hilarious. This is a kind of just stupid, convoluted policy and its outcomes. You've had Israel essentially just move all the way in, annex all of the Golan Heights, which is what they've wanted to do for a while. Again, it's a very important area for water resources, and it also overlooks Damascus, the capital. So it gives them, it's like the highest point in Syria. It gives them a commanding view, very important strategic position. After HTS took power, in the last week, I believe, Israel has gone on the mother of all bombing campaigns. They have bombed Syria over 800 times. They have destroyed any remnant of what was left of any sort of defensive military capabilities from the leftover government. So like air bases, highways, ammunition stockpiles. The Syrian Navy sunk in the harbour at Latakia. And this has been kind of, people have talked about it as if it's the biggest kind of nationwide bombing raid since the shock and awe campaign against Saddam.
Yep.
And just so you know where HTS's loyalties lie, lots of people have come out and said, well, Israel has just invaded your country, annexed. They're in the Golan Heights, waving Israeli flags, bombing what is now your territory. What are you going to do about it? And HTS have the party line of, Israel's not our enemy, so they can keep doing what they want. I think this kind of, for the Syrian people, I want a stable state where they can prosper. It's one of the oldest inhabited places on Earth.
Yes, ancient Mesopotamia.
Exactly, and there's so much incredible, beautiful, rich history and culture there. However, I think it is quite depressing because I do not think that will survive. I think the country will be more and more balkanized.
Yep.
I think the Turks will have a slice. The Kurds will have a slice, which the Turks will probably eventually just annex from the Kurds because they're just not going to let that happen. I think Israel will expand. And also what's important is they are going to use this to cut off Lebanon. So it's a big blow for the resistance because one of Hezbollah's main supply chains was through Syria.
From Iran through to Syria to support Hezbollah in Lebanon.
Yeah. And that was why it was just like, if you thought this all was a coincidence, the day after Israel signed, then I have like an $800 billion weapons package and a chemical weapons false flag to sell you, Another thing before we finish is that, as we talked about a little bit about the Syrian economy beforehand, so it was essentially a food and energy sufficient country. And like all food and energy sufficient countries, you become an enemy of the global, the global neoliberal cartel, run out of the Pentagon via the IMF and the World Bank. First thing Jelani came out and said was, we're going to open up to everyone, investors, the entire world come in, we're going to cut our country up, sell it off to the highest bidder, which is not going to help the Syrians, the economic state of the average Syrian. I do hope that there can, even though I think HTS and Jelani are disgusting human beings, I do hope that, eventually maybe they can stabilise, create a state with some resources, and some independence and improve the lives of Syrians, which has just been destroyed for your average Syrian over the last, since 2011. However, I don't think that will be the case purely because, again, the strategic importance of losing Syria is that you move on to Iraq, you isolate Hezbollah in Lebanon, you cut off the Palestinian resistance, and then you move on to the Golden Goose, which in the eyes of all neocons, Zionists, and Salafi jihadists, funny how they're all on the same page about this, the goal is Iran. And then once Iran goes, that's just essentially American, Israeli, Anglo domination of the Middle East there, and their proxies. So I think given the realities of what I think, even though it's been a really brutal, hard time, I think there are still going to be harder times to come for the Syrian people. But that being said, I'm not going to deny agency to them and say that as much as I kind of appreciated the Ba'athist movement, political movement for what it is, as kind of a secular Arab nationalist movement, it's obviously apparent that it ran its course.
Yeah.
And
Yep.
yeah, it's up to the Syrians to decide what is the right thing for them next.
I guess it'll be kind of quite fascinating to see what develops over
It will be fascinating
over the coming months.
It'll be very interesting.
Yeah,
Again,
especially with a Trump administration now.
yeah, everyone talks about Trump and how they're like, he's going to pull out of Ukraine. Probably won't happen. Or it's my opinion personally. He has talked a big talk, but like going against the entrenched military security state.
Yeah.
That's very bad. That destroys nations.
Yeah.
It's a very hard thing for Trump to do, and I think that would just give him a deal that's too good to pass, and he'll go along with it essentially.
Well, that was a big segment. I
segment.
appreciate you for breaking that down.
all
It
right,
is
man.
very fascinating, and there's a kind of rich history and context to understand what's going on.
Yeah, and the Syrian dirty war, civil war,
Yeah.
whatever you want to call it, that's actually what probably spurred my interest in kind of alternative politics in India in the first place.
Yeah,
So it's kind of come to its logical and sad end.
Yeah. All right. Well, we should probably wrap up the podcast shortly. Before we do,
Yes. We're gonna end
on
it
a slightly more joyful note. So, have you been looking up to the skies recently?
Me?
Yeah.
Myself? Not any more than usual, Jordie.
Not any more usual?
Not any more than usual.
Well, I don't know if you noticed, but not in Australia. Something has been going on over in the beautiful state of New Jersey, United States.
Yes.
Something that has caught the attention of the world.
Yeah.
And it's quite fascinating. There are massive sightings,
Yeah.
beginning in New Jersey, of drones flying in the skies.
Yeah.
And this began about a month ago. People seeing drones up in the skies. There was reports that there were drones over US military facilities and bases.
May I interject and just say,
Yeah.
we should maybe clarify, we're saying drones, but lots of these people don't necessarily know.
Correct.
Yes.
So we'll hang on a second.
Yeah,
they're being
we'll get
dubbed.
to it.
So they're being dubbed drones. This podcast is a political podcast. We try to analyze politics. I'm not a ufologist. I'm not an expert.
Oh, we are now, Jordie.
No. But it's been really fascinating, and there's a really interesting, I think, political angle to look at this.
Yes.
Really fascinating.
Yep.
So, there's been these mass sightings.
Yep.
Basically, what has happened is that all the kind of mayors and governors inside these, because it's not just New Jersey now, there's heaps of other states on the eastern side of the US, right to the west.
Yep.
The police forces, mayors, and governors have been getting together and saying, like, what's going on?
Yeah.
We are getting hundreds, thousands of reports of these drones.
Yeah.
And it's not just people seeing a drone up in the sky. It's now the police force saying, we saw 50 of these objects coming from the ocean, overland. The US Coast Guard has reported seeing 10, 20 of them following their ships.
Yeah.
Like, those reports from US officials are really fascinating.
They are.
The politicians now are taking this really seriously. There has been a congressional hearing last week in the United States, and it's basically the politicians, the legislators, the lawmakers asking the federal government, asking Homeland Security, asking the FBI, what is going on?
Yeah.
And their answer, we don't know.
Yeah.
We don't know anything more than you. There is no national security threat, and we will leave it at that. However, this has not stopped some really interesting kind of political speculation, to say the least. So there is a phenomenon going on.
Yeah.
There's a serious mystery at hand. There is no doubt about that.
The plot thickens.
The plot thickens.
Yeah.
But this has not stopped the crackpots coming out of the woodwork. And the first one was just a couple of days after this started to blow up, about 10 days ago. Yeah.
I did see they were blaming it on Iran at one stage.
Well, this was a Republican senator, I believe, in America, came out and had this to say.
Republican Jersey lawmaker claims the drones are linked to an Iranian ship off the Jersey shore.
Iran launched a mothership probably about a month ago that contains these drones. That mothership is off, I'm going to tell you the deal. It's off the east coast of the United States of America.
There is not any truth to that.
Those claims, though, quickly debunked by the Department of Defense.
There is no Iranian ship off the coast of the United States, and there's no so-called mothership launching drones towards the United
It was Iran.
I love how in our kind of like post-truth era that we're living through right now, I love how politicians can come out and just speak as if, matter of fact, there is an Iranian mothership off the coast of America.
As if that exists. As if that is a real thing.
Yeah, I know.
It's an Iranian.
I'm going to be speaking facts here. It's just, it's absolutely like really wild. So obviously the Pentagon shut that down immediately.
Yeah.
What was interesting is I was sitting here in Australia watching this, and to begin with, I was kind of like looking up different news services. I was kind of like, what is happening? I want to sort of get my head around this.
You got to get to the bottom of it.
And so what I kind of do usually, my base level analysis begins with the rich, journalistic, beautiful public outlet that we have here called the ABC.
Yes.
I use it as my baseline.
Okay, all right. It's a beacon of light.
It is
in
a beacon of light.
swamp that is the Australian media ecosystem.
Correct. And so I usually tune in because it gives me kind of a little bit of a gauge of how the kind of Australian journalistic class and political class are seeing things.
Kind of like the liberal intelligentsia, shall we say,
and how Australian politicians, because let's remember that most Australian politicians do probably still kind of, obviously they have contacts inside the ABC, they listen to the ABC, whether on television or radio. So this is where they're getting the information. And this obviously influences policymakers in Australia. So I do think that's really important to kind of understand how they're seeing things. And so I tuned into the ABC. And who was there? Who were they interviewing on the ABC? But no other than the director of ASPI. And so, James, would you like to just briefly fill in who ASPI is here in Australia?
ASPI are the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. They are another figurehead and beacon of light. They are stuck in the 1950s trying to fight against communism, brown people, anything that would be good for the military-industrial complex. ASPI.
So
ASPI's main sponsors are like, sorry, I'm being a bit facetious there. ASPI is a think tank, essentially, and they are funded by the Australian Department of Defence, the US Department of Defence, the British, I believe the Brits are in there as well, Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, all of the friends of humanity, they sponsor ASPI. And ASPI is that kind of quintessential group that they will, for example, if there's something vaguely related to anything, the ABC will defer to their local expert, who is some think tanker from ASPI, who immediately turns it around to, we need to invest in weapons.
So they're our militarist think tank here in Australia. Okay, and when I was watching this, I thought, oh great, the ABC is going to have someone on from the FBI. They're going to have a American like drone expert on. I was like, this is actually like, okay, I'm going to get like 3 minutes. And then our armchair Cold War warrior, Dr. Malcolm David, came on. And I keep forgetting this man's name because he has two first names, Dr. Malcolm David. And he's the head of ASPI.
He's also one of the most forgettable men on earth.
He is. But what I find so fascinating is that we're talking about like UAPs, drones, and the ABC's go-to is this warmongering in chief. And this is what he had to say about the drones. And I wasn't really surprised, but anyway.
Area which I think is really clouding the subject. So I do think we need to focus on the higher end threat of adversary states operating the larger drones over military bases and try and distinguish those from these lower end FPV drones that are probably causing confusion everywhere.
And of course, some experts have also noted that these drones resemble something called drone motherships that were deployed in Ukraine, Russia, and China. Do you think that's the case as well?
It's a possibility. And if they are being operated by foreign actors, then part of the role that these things could be doing is essentially training for these foreign actors to be able to utilize drones in attacks on these bases. But the key question in my mind then is, how are these foreign actors getting these drones to these locations? Where are they launching them from? Where are they recovering them from? Because these drones have to fly from somewhere and return to somewhere. So I don't understand why the US military is not gathering more intelligence, not bringing one down, not tracking them and following them to find their point of origin. There's a series of questions there that need to be further addressed in my mind.
And, in defense circles, Malcolm, I would assume that there is talk about regulatory moves in countries to basically stop these drones from operating in at least certain perimeters around more sensitive areas. Is that being talked about a lot in defense circles at the moment?
Well, certainly. And, these regulations are in place, but ultimately regulations can't stop the actions of a foreign state that is willing just to simply launch these drones and fly them into our airspace. Nor can they necessarily stop an individual that has a drone in his or her possession and then uses them to violate those regulations.
Sorry, I don't need to say. I wonder why the US military hasn't taken one down. Obviously, he did. What's his name again? Sorry,
Dr. Malcolm David.
Obviously, Malcolm David didn't get the memo.
No, he did not. I just find it so fascinating that he just speaks as if these things are state-sponsored adversary drones.
Foreign adversary states.
Instantly. And then he goes like, we need to distinguish between the larger drones, which are obviously Chinese and Russian drones, potentially from a mothership, and then these smaller operating drones from people in the US. And it's
the
just...
small operating drones, which are most likely Iranian.
Yeah, but no, you're right. He really is living in the 1950s. It's incredible because everything kind of relates to this kind of like Cold War tensions, where anything happens that kind of like this, for example, it's instantly, okay, right, it has to be an adversary. Yeah. We have to allow more powers to our military and state authorities,
Yeah. And it's like, look, man, he'll advocate for pushing a certain defense policy or set of defense policies, which will then boost the prices of, Boeing and Lockheed and BAE and the share prices.
Counter-drone warfare technology, new drones for the Australian military, etc., etc.
Of course, man. And I'm not going to say the whole thing. We're talking about this earlier, you and I. And I'm not going to say, obviously, the whole thing is a psyop. Yeah. I think the whole UFO subject is hilarious. And there is room to be serious about the subject.
Of course, yeah. However,
it's just funny, for one, I find. But two, there is just so many layers of psyoping on top. Like he's not Lindsey Graham, but I'm going to call him Lindsey Graham because he's got two first names and he loves war. But these people just, there's so many layers that just get stacked onto it immediately. But like you're saying, no one has... The funny thing is, no one has actually, like, the US Department of Defense has come out and said, look,
this is not a foreign adversary.
Not a foreign adversary state.
Yeah.
And so there is a genuine mystery to it.
Yeah.
And that's exciting. Again, he didn't get the memo.
He did not get the memo. And already, though, we're seeing... I'll just quickly finish on this.
Please.
We're already seeing legislation now in the US which is going to give... the federal government much more power to intercept drones and invest in drone warfare technology. And then obviously we have our friend here, Dr. Malcolm Roberts here in Australia, advocating for the exact same thing. And like that Republican senator before, speaking about an Iranian mothership, he took the exact same line, but a line that was more palatable to the Australian kind of liberal democratic class.
Yeah, it's like, oh, look, we didn't like George Bush or against the invasion of Iraq, but Putin's evil and Xi's evil and the Ayatollahs are evil and we need to invest in drone warfare because X-Man said so. One thing that you mentioned earlier as well, I believe, didn't you say they were thinking of looking at possibly banning Chinese consumer drones to stimulate US domestic production? Was that something that, or am I imagining that?
No. So there was a law that was narrowly voted down in the past year in the US, which was to ban Chinese drones. Mm-hmm. And now you can imagine if that law is put before Congress, that will now be passed.
Yeah.
Yes.
Hilarious.
Anyway, interesting story.
One thing as well to note, I do think it's funny that these people always report that these drones and these unidentified craft are being seen around US Air Force bases. I maintain the opinion if I threw a paper plane over a US Air Force base, my house would probably get hit by a drone strike. They would kill me straight away. Again, a little bit suspicious that these things are always around Air Force bases. I don't know. Just some food for thought.
Yeah.
But hilarious nonetheless.
Yeah.
We will be bringing you all the UAP and drone-related content in the future. Pardon me. Any other cunning news you reckon for the week, Jordie?
No, I think we'll wrap it up there. Yep. Next week we shall be doing a Christmas special.
Yep.
Look back at the year that's been,
Yep.
some of the interesting developments.
Yep.
And I will do some research and break down Dutton's nuclear proposal.
Yeah, and Dutton gets a lot of love around Christmas time because you usually have a roast meal for Christmas lunch,
Yep.
which entails you often have roast potatoes. You also have potato salad.
Yep.
It's a popular side in Australia.
And he looks like a potato.
And he looks like a potato.
Correct.
Thank you, everyone, for sticking around. Obviously, we have been a bit inconsistent recently with Jordie being away and obviously with the difficulty of having a full-time job and trying to maintain relationships and friendships, trying to stay sane and trying to pump out good content. But we will be back next week and then back with more of it next year.
Yeah.
So
thanks for joining us. Please like, subscribe, and comment. We'd really appreciate it. And we shall see you next week.
see you next week.
Thanks.
See you guys.
Bye.